Well, it turns out that this report is relatively topical at the moment. There's a lot of debate in the public sphere about the management of defence and about the relationship between the Minister and the Department of Defence. But this isn't a response to these very short-term events. We began looking at this late last year, really as an attempt to try and say something constructive that could help along the way to delivering Force 2030, the government's vision they put out in the 2009 White Paper. As you said, there's a reform program underway, the Strategic Reform Program, and there's a lot to be said in favour of that. There's some real savings being delivered, there's some great relationships being forged between industry and the department that in the past weren't as strong as they used to be. But while these are all positive, they don't really get down to some of the core fundamental issues about how defence is managed. And this report attempts to lay out an agenda for some fundamental reform of how defence goes about its business. There are 4 key recommendations. The first one has to do with accountability. Not simply accountability in terms of putting the finger on someone when something goes wrong, but the way in which the control of resources within the department is properly aligned with responsibility for delivering what defence delivers, which at the end of the day is military operations and preparedness for military operations. At the moment, the control of the resources is diffused across the organisation. As a result of reforms back in the late 1990s, the service chiefs in particular don't control anywhere close to even half of the resources that go into making up the capabilities that they're responsible for delivering. And that produces problems. It means that when something goes wrong, people are pointing fingers this way and that way. So the first recommendation is to align accountability and responsibility and put control of the resources back in the hands of those people who are nominally responsible for delivering capability, the service chiefs. Second recommendation, perhaps a little paradoxical, is to strengthen central control. At the moment, defence is run very much like a federation. There's 14 separate groups. Each of these groups is an entity to itself, and the actual outcomes of defence, the things it produces, emerge from the cooperation and loose coordination between these 14 groups, of which the 3 services, Army, Navy and Air Force, are only 3. Compared with the commercial world, where cooperation of the complexity and size of defence would be very tightly managed, would have a dedicated headquarters that collected management information, which monitored performance, which delivered sanctions and rewards for performance as necessary. Defence lacks a lot of these basic mechanisms. So our second recommendation, strengthen central control, get the management information that's needed so that the Secretary and the Chief of the Defence Force can manage the organisation and deliver to the government what it wants. Third recommendation concerns contestability. Over the last 4 or 5 years, in fact over the last decade, it's hard to open up a newspaper and not see a story about a defence project that's run off the rails. To some extent, that's never going to end. Defence projects have a high degree of intrinsic risk built into them, and if you want a cutting-edge defence force, you're going to have to take some risks, and you're going to have to take it on the chin when things go wrong. Nonetheless, the question's got to be asked is whether the risk is being consciously assessed and prudently managed at the point at which projects are conceived. In the past, there was a very strong internal contestability function in defence, which looked at projects and asked the hard questions. And in particular, whether that extra increment of capability was worth that extra $100 million that it might cost, and more importantly, that extra bite of risk that is attending the extra capability. That's been lost over the last decade or so, so our third recommendation is to restore robust internal contestability in defence to make sure that the risks are consciously and properly being assessed before projects are initiated. Fourth recommendation is not so much about how defence operates itself, but the way in which defence exposes itself or allows itself to be scrutinised more broadly. When I say more broadly, all of the players, the media, parliamentary committees, Australian National Audit Office, and even think tanks like ASPI, the ability of the government to make informed decisions about defence depends upon how this network of external players provides some assistance, provides some alternative views, provides scrutiny of how defence is performing. The alternative, to keep defence secret and to keep external parties out, would mean that the government would be much like in the position of a health minister that only got advice from doctors, or an education minister that only got advice from the teachers' union. They'd be getting a very narrow, self-interested set of advice. So in order to allow these external players to assist the government in assessing and plotting a course for defence, what we need is greater openness. We need to be able to assess much more easily than we can now what it costs for defence to do what it does and how well it's doing what it's been asked to do. Unfortunately, over the last few years, the amount of information that's been available in the public domain has decreased, whereas what we need is exactly the opposite. Now, these four recommendations we've put are relatively high level. Defence is a sprawling and complex organisation, and to have it run like the Swiss watch that everyone would like it to run like will require lots and lots of detailed work. But we believe that these four recommendations, high level as they are, would create the environment, would create the structures that would set defence on a path so that the government could, over time, refine its performance and get the outcomes that it wants and deserves.